This video will show you how to first of all score at a merit level for the Bivariate Analysis Achievement Standard 91581. I highly recommend you bring your report to a merit standard and then take a look at the end of this video how we talk about bringing it to an excellent. So first of all, you're going to have to pay close attention to the marking scheme provided by your instructor. It might be different from what is presented here, and some things are open to interpretation by your instructor. You basically have to follow what is required. Now, we need to make a hypothesis here regarding our question. The question is, has the number of visitors to New Zealand had an effect on how much we export? So we'll make a hypothesis. I believe that if New Zealand has more visitors, then this will result in greater amounts of exports in New Zealand dollars. This marking scheme says and or reasoning for choosing this question. We might as well do both of those requirements just in case. Reasoning for this study. New Zealand spends a lot of money on the tourism industry, and it would be valuable to know if this effort not only helps the local national economy in the tourism industry, but also could have an positive impact on the export industries of New Zealand. Make sure spell check is on, and as you go along, fix up your work. Read this to make sure it makes sense. New Zealand spends a lot of money on the tourism industry, and it would be valuable to know if this effort not only helps the local national economy in the tourism industry, but also if it has a positive impact on the export industries of New Zealand. That's great reasoning for the study, and I would consider this to be done at a merit level. The plan still is okay at a merit level. Also notice in my edit that in my plan I forget to include the fact that we're gonna make predictions using the model. At a merit level, any problems or worries about the data are identified. So I can reveal, in fact, that if you followed the first video to achieve, you've actually already done this item. Now, we need to talk a bit about this. You cannot ignore, if you trust your data, you cannot simply ignore this item. Please comment on the source of data and comment on its reliability. The reason why I think InfoShare is a reliable source of information here. InfoShare is reliable because it is a government provided data source by the New Zealand government. So I've also gone ahead and justified why I trust the data. Overall, you need to be making justifications for your merit score. Now, possible outliers are identified in context. Let's take care of that. Forgot to give this a heading. Let's give this a heading. So possible outliers, again, if you don't think there's any outliers, you cannot just ignore this section. You need to comment on if you think there are any outliers. Now, I don't see any here. if there was a spot down here or maybe a spot up here, you might want to take a look at the data set and assess whether or not those are outliers, but just make a comment here. Doesn't appear to be any obvious outliers. No closer scrutiny of the data is required. That's this section completed. This is in the analysis of the actual data itself. And just as a quick note to viewers, if you use the awesome strategy for writing each and every analysis paragraph, then you're setting yourself up for an excellence score. So I'm going to do the analysis to excellence right now. So if you set up your paragraphs, first of all, with an observation, and then you provide a specific example in the actual data regarding your observation, and then if you give that observation some meaning and contextual information, then you're setting yourself up for an excellent score on your analysis. So let's go ahead and bring each of our observations to an excellence score. The first observation I made here, I noticed that as the number of visitors goes up, the exports also goes up. This shows a positive relationship between the number of visitors to New Zealand and the amount we export in New Zealand. So that's meaning already. We just need to provide some sort of specific example here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the data. We're going to want to pick out specific data points from the data set and go ahead and do that. I just made note of the units here on the graph so I can sort of talk about a range. So I'll say over the range of 0 to 10 million people, we visiting New Zealand, we see a corresponding increase in exports, and that's in New Zealand dollars, from 0 to 10 billion New Zealand dollars. And I'll say this relationship continues over the entire range of the data set, where the maximum visitors to New Zealand is, we'll just take a quick look at the graph. It's looking like it's about 26 million people, and the maximum exports in the data set is about, you have to zoom in to see what's happening here with this axis. Okay, so let's, right, so that'd be, the max here is $50 billion, and we'll see, yeah, we were just under that once. The maximum exports in the data set is about $49 billion. Over this whole range, the trend remains consistent. Alright, so what I've done here is I've included specific data. I'm justifying my observations with specific data, and I'm including units on all the data that's presented. Maybe I can put in here people visiting New Zealand. There we go. And this is worth, might be a bit over the top, but it's worth merit there. We'll get rid of my note here for the units. Now, the meaning here for excellence, this shows a positive relationship between the number of visitors to New Zealand and the amount we export in New Zealand over the years of 1922 to 2011. That's my first analysis done to an excellence level. Now, move on to strength of the relationship between visitors and exports. Upon visual inspection, I noticed that the data points, okay, there's my observation, are all quite close to the regression line or the trend line. This indicates that there is possibly a strong relationship between the number of visitors to New Zealand and the amount we export in New Zealand dollars. All right, so I'm linking this to the wider context, so that's done at an excellence level there. We just need to make reference to some actual data points. Maybe we can talk about the fact that after about this data point here, things get a little bit further from the trend line. So we've got a bit of a range to talk about here with reference to the scatter. So we're looking at 0 to about 15 million. Between 0 and 15 million visitors to New Zealand. The data points are all very close to the regression line. After 15 million visitors to New Zealand, the data points become more scattered around the trend line. Let's be consistent, we'll just keep calling it a regression line. I'm going to go ahead and connect this with some meaning. This is showing us that when visitors to New Zealand exceeds 15 million people, and the impact on exports is more variable. So what's that saying is basically because these data points are further from the trend line than these ones as a group, as soon as we seem to have more than 15 million visitors to New Zealand, the impact on exports is quite a bit more variable. Now, that's my second observation done to an excellence level. We'll just tie this sentence together a little bit better. This further indicates that there is possibly a strong relationship between the number of visitors to New Zealand and the amount we export in New Zealand dollars. So we need to make sure this observation here, or this link to context, is I'm going to just say overall these observations indicate that there's possibly a strong relationship between the number of visitors to New Zealand and the amount we export New Zealand dollars. So there's an observation done at an excellence level. Now, the next one is the R value. It's representing the strength. Got that. Reporting the R value. Interpreting it correctly using the chart, because we are bringing in the complete context. Maybe we can go a little bit wider here with the context, looking at this requirement for excellence, that statements are linked to the wider context and research. So I'm going to add a little bit to this and say we have further evidence that strongly suggests the more visitors that come to New Zealand, the greater the positive impact on the exporting industry. Now, we're going to go ahead and comment on the linear model to an excellence level. So we've reported the equation in two forms. That's good. Let's see. So we've clearly defined the relationship here. So we could possibly talk about the gradient here for merit. So the gradient of 15663 tells us we get 15663 New Zealand dollars per exported per visitor to New Zealand. Now, that's fantastic. For every visitor we get to New Zealand, according to this model, we're exporting over $15,000. So we've commented on gradient. Let's connect the statement to the wider context, and we'll do that by saying this outstanding figure clearly shows that increasing visitors to New Zealand can have a profound impact on our exports industries. Now, on to our next observation, other identifying features. I noticed that the more visitors there are, the data seems to be spread out. Specifically, after about 1.6 million visitors, you can see that the exports tend to become more scattered around the trend line. So taking a closer look at this observation I made before, I realized I got my one extra zero on these observations here, so I'm going to immediately fix that up. So we're sort of repeating ourselves with these groups, with these other identifying features. So I'm going to have to figure out how to take another angle on that observation. So what I'm going to say here is to connect with my next section here with predictions. This could possibly tell us that the model we will use for making predictions will be less accurate for values over number of visitors to New Zealand greater than 1.6. So this is a nice lead up to the predictions, and it's a courtesy to the reader because we're admitting that our model is going to be weaker when we have more visitors to New Zealand. We're less sure about what level of exports we're going to have, and this increased scatter in this area is what's telling us that. So that's a different take on a previous observation that we made. So I think that's going to be all right for excellence. Predictions. So there might be some requirements for predictions, need to be sensibly rounded, and looks like that's been done already. Let's have the complete context here. So next, I'm going to take a look here on the marking scheme. The reliability of the prediction is assessed. Let's go ahead and do that. Since we have observed that number of visitors to New Zealand greater than 1.6 million people results in greater variability in exports. We are not entirely confident with this. There is a greater chance that the prediction is not completely accurate, since we are trying to predict the side of the data range. This extrapolation will have a varying degree of error to it. So we're not quite sure about the level of error. That's not part of this standard, but we are admitting that since we're trying to make a prediction outside of the data range, we could be wrong simply because the predictions made in this range, according to this model, for example, here, if we predicted at this level, the model would be really inaccurate. It would be too low. But if we predicted at this number of visitors, you can see the model's predicting too high of exports. So we're taking all that into consideration by making that point that we're trying to make a prediction way out here, and who knows, exports could be way up here perhaps, they could be down here. We're not quite sure. But for excellence, we'll try to give a basic indication of what we could expect. I'd say that's between 30, we'll say 30 and 55 billion. Sure, why not? Now this is going to be for excellence by using a visual approximation of the data and the scatter. 3 million visitors to New Zealand. Exports in New Zealand dollars could be anywhere between 30 billion New Zealand dollars and 5 billion New Zealand dollars. Great. So that's the predictions done to an excellence level, perhaps, possibly not. I'm going to go further with this observation and say this is telling us that should the government invest money into tourism to get onwards of 3 million visitors, the impact on exports in New Zealand dollars would not be known with a very good level of accuracy. But we can be sure that the trend would tell us that more visitors so I'm trying to link this to the wider context, and here's my attempt. This is telling us that should the government invest money into tourism to get onwards of 3 million visitors to New Zealand, the impact on exports in New Zealand dollars would not be known with a very good level of accuracy, but we can be sure that the trend would remain consistent, that more visitors would bring a result of more exports out of New Zealand. All right, so got to see some live editing there. As you can see, my style of writing is just to sort of get it out, but then immediately do some editing just to make sure it all makes sense and is accurate. Great. That's the analysis section done to an excellence level. Let's go ahead and finish this to a merit level and take a look at the conclusion. Solution to the problem is linked to the context and hypothesis. From 1922 to 2011, has the number of visitors to New Zealand had an effect on how much we export? This analysis shows the number of visitors and the amount of New Zealand exports, and the amount New Zealand exports in New Zealand dollars is positively related. All right, so there is a strong relationship between these two variables. We are able to predict how much we may export based on how many people visit our country. This conclusion corresponds well with our hypothesis. We indeed predicted that if New Zealand has more visitors, then New Zealand will also export more in dollars. Now, what we also want to do is justify these conclusions, and our main evidence was the high correlation coefficient for the relationship between number of visitors to New Zealand and exports in New Zealand dollars. Have a quick look up, make sure we get it right, 0.98907. What is the main piece of evidence to suggest our conclusions? And that should be enough for a merit level conclusion. Now, that should be the whole report done to merit level, with quite a few sections pushing on excellence. I'd like to stress that the angle I'm taking on this research is the reasoning for the study, as in the value of what my conclusion could be. Now, your instructor most likely will expect you to give reasoning for your hypothesis, and I mean, I technically haven't done that, so I'm going to add that in and say I think this is intuitive and would be true, especially if business people come to New Zealand and see export business opportunities. All right, so I gave some reasoning for my hypothesis. That's going to help for excellence. And now you may want to go into the internet, do some searching around to try and back your hypothesis. And that's the sort of link that your instructor might want to see you have some sort of supporting evidence that your hypothesis is true. I took a bit of a different angle on my report and focused on why I wanted to do the report and the value the conclusion could have for further supporting the tourism industry. So what I'm going to do now is go over the assessment schedule, take a look specifically at the introduction requirements for excellence. So we'll zoom in a little bit here, and it looks like hypothesis or reasoning is backed by appropriate research. So I'm going to take an angle here that could be a bit risky, but what I'm going to do is focus on the reasoning for this study. And basically what you need to do to score excellence is to go to the internet and have a sniff around for information that's relevant to your topic. So I did a search on should New Zealand invest in tourism and opened up a link to Tourism 2025, and this is a document discussing the fact that it is the government's intention to invest in tourism. So the angle I'm going to take here is the study can further back the government's decisions to invest in the tourism industry and give justification for a heavy focus on promoting tourism. So focusing on this link I found regarding Tourism 2025, I found a pretty good short paragraph here that I'm going to use in my report, stating that the Tourism 2025 growth framework aims to almost double the economic contribution of New Zealand's tourism industry to $41 billion by 2025, and that will require significant investment in supporting infrastructure. So we're going to copy that and paste it into the report, and we're going to have to properly reference this. According to tourism2025.org.nz, so we're going to put that in quotes, and we're going to reference this properly. So that's the website and the date of the article. Looks like that was July 2015. So now that I have a reference, I'm going to immediately go to the bottom of my document and put a references section, and that would be 2015. That's the title. So we're going to copy the title. Now I'm going to copy the actual link to the article, paste it, and then put in the date that I've accessed this article. So that's the reference done. The actual format of your reference might be different from what your instructor is expecting. So if they've given you exact information about how to do this part, then you should follow your instructor's information, please. Now, I'm going to go back up here to follow this up, and we'll say this report can be submitted to the Tourism 2025 group if it indeed links together visitors to New Zealand and how much we export in New Zealand dollars. So we've brought our justification for the study to an excellence level. What you can also do is focus on your hypothesis, which could be a really good idea when you're going online and doing your searching. You would simply search for things that relate to your hypothesis. I chose to focus on the reasoning behind this study and give it an actual meaningful real purpose value, which is well thought out, and I would actually submit this to the group because this looks pretty good. Anyways, that's the introduction done to an excellence level. Okay, so we've taken care of that. This is the analysis section, which we've taken care of at an excellence level already. Now we need to work on our conclusion to bring that up to an excellence level. We're going to bring in some insight to the conclusion by stating we noticed increased scatter around the regression line with number of visitors greater than about 1.6 million. This indicates that predictions made with this model will be less accurate for values greater than 1.6 million. That's the number of visitors to New Zealand. So we've provided a limitation to our conclusion. So we're going to have to get into confounding variables, and you're going to definitely want to link your confounding variables to further investigation attempted or suggested with reasoning. So we're going to have here confounding variables section, and what you need to understand is that the y variable or the response variable is going to be impacted by a large number of different things. So of course we chose to look at the number of visitors to New Zealand's impact on total exports, but there are other variables that affect total exports. For example, I would guess that this dip here is most likely after the 2008 recession that hit the world. So the global economy's condition is definitely going to impact total exports, and that's the main thing that we can talk about. The condition of the global economy would also have a large impact on the amount New Zealand exports in New Zealand dollars. For example, after the 2008 economic crash, New Zealand's export economy was most likely impacted in a negative way. Now, you could go over the top and link into something that would prove this and reference that. I'm not going to bother because according to NZQA, you only need one reference in your study to achieve at excellence. So I'm just going to comment on the fact that if this was, a university paper, something you would want to reference right there. So we're identifying the confounding variable would be the condition of the global economy. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to link that confounding variable to another investigation. So another investigation would have to be made which looked at global economic condition indices and compare those to New Zealand exports in New Zealand dollars. Now, I'm going to bring up two confounding variables. So let's go back up to the graph here. And we got to think, okay, what else might impact total exports? Well, I think what might impact total exports as well could possibly be also the economic conditions of the dairy industry are known to have an impact on the amount we export in New Zealand dollars. Another study could look into the price of dairy products in relation to how much we export, how much New Zealand exports in New Zealand dollars. So we've identified two confounding variables, and at the same time we've further investigated suggestion, and we've also suggested a further investigation for both of those confounding variables. Now, what might be lacking is reasoning. So let's give a reason for doing this. This analysis would show us the connection between global economic conditions and exports from New Zealand. Now, I'm going to really get into this with the reasoning. So, furthermore, we could also correlate the economic conditions with the number of visitors to New Zealand. Having studied all three factors in a bivariate analysis would make the relationship between the three factors more clear. Here's some higher level reasoning behind our discussion of confounding variables. Let's go ahead and look at reasoning for looking into the dairy industry suddenly. We may find that the dairy industry has an impact on the amount of export. It may make it easier to isolate the specific amount of exports that could be related to tourism alone. This could be enough reasoning for doing this. We may find that the dairy industry has an impact on the amount of exports, so it may make it easier to isolate the specific amount of exports that could be related to tourism alone. I'll just make it more clear. For example, in certain years, we may have lower exports due to the dairy industry, but have higher exports due to tourism. Also, identify a further study. It would be interesting to slide the data by 1 year so that we could see if the number of visitors to New Zealand in 1 year has an impact on the amount we export the next year. We could even slide the data to make a 2-year difference to see if tourism ends up affecting exports 2 years later. This type of study would examine the time lag effect that may be necessary between business people visiting New Zealand and them setting up an import-export business situation. So what I'm saying is here, for example, number of visitors in 2011 may impact exports in 2012 or even more in 2013. Knowing this information would be useful for government and economic planning for the future. Should we know the time lag expected between having people visit New Zealand and seeing the payoff in exports. So this really seals the deal for excellence if there was any question about it. Because your data sets may be based on time, you can possibly suggest your own time lag study and provide justification for your own data set. Now, I'm also going to tie this up quite nicely because what I did in the introduction was suggest, hey, we can help the tourism industry and the government's mission to promote tourism and spend money on promoting tourism. Hey, we can help them if this study tells us what we're suspicious of. So indeed, our conclusions are quite strong based on high correlation that if New Zealand has more visitors, then New Zealand will also export more New Zealand dollars. This conclusion and study can be communicated with the government and tourism industry as evidence that their efforts are having positive impacts on the New Zealand exports industries. For example, I'm going to bring in another link that I had lined up. So I did a search on New Zealand tourism and exports, and here at tourism industry, we've got some quick facts and figures on the positives regarding the efforts to promote the tourism industry. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this. For example, we're going to properly reference this. So that doesn't look like it's dated. So usually in that case, you'll use the date of the copyright on the page. And in that case, you use the date accessed. So we'll leave it at 2016. So we're going to conclude here that this study can be submitted to the Tourism Industry Association of New Zealand. So let's fix that up. For example, from the Tourism Industry Association New Zealand. There we go. This study can be submitted to the Tourism Industry Association New Zealand as evidence that efforts to promote tourism also impact the amount New Zealand exports in New Zealand dollars. They can add it to their list of benefits and link to high school excellence. Well, as far as I'm concerned, this is holistically an excellence level paper. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoy applying what you've watched in this video to the context of your own work. And of course, before I get too excited, I definitely want to make note of this reference at the very end of my paper. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to share this video and subscribe and like us. You're definitely going to want to edit your work once. It's good to take a step away from your work and make sure anything that has a underlined red, you want to make sure it's not a spelling mistake. You could possibly put in the reference to the actual data. You would want to do that if you're wanting to score excellence. And you'd want to really scan your document to make sure no spelling mistakes. You want to edit your document to make sure there's units whenever there's values presented. And most importantly, you don't want to bring any new evidence into a conclusion. All you want to do is remind the reader of your question, answer the question, and then just chip away at scoring higher according to your marking scheme. But you want to make sure that you're not contradicting yourself. You want to make sure that there's evidence for your conclusions. If your R value is really low, for example, you cannot make strong conclusions because they will not make sense.
Are you stumped? Maybe we can help. Book a Skype session right now, get tutored from your home over Skype, and reach your goals. No professional would ever submit without having a pro look at their work. With so much on the line, why would your work be any different? Go to highschoolexcellence.com to see how you can submit your reports for professional feedback and get the scores that you need to succeed.